Welcome, friends, enemies, and everyone in between, to my channel, The Masked Mormon. I am in fact the Masked Mormon.
Why are you wearing a mask? Were you burned by acid or something like that?
Oh no, it's just they're terribly comfortable. I think everyone will be wearing them in the future.
If you've been here before, I am so glad you could come back. If this is your first time here, I am a Mormon who used to believe in the truth claims of the Mormon Church. Now, I explore some of the implications of Mormon theology, culture, and some of my own personal experiences, and talk about it on the internet with you fine viewers. I was looking over the viewership of my last couple of videos, and I want to thank everyone who has watched. I really appreciate it. As a small channel, it is nice to see viewership increase. I really hope you like the content I produce. There are already so many Mormon YouTubers that put out great content, and I can second guess myself by wondering if I really have anything to offer this space. But I think having lots of different voices, both large and small, can resonate with all kinds of people. Mormonism is such a fascinating subject, and it affects so many people in so many different ways. Today, I'm going to be talking about one of my own personal experiences, and it delves into not only Mormonism, but also my own personal and family history, and some pretty heavy racial implications as it relates to Native Americans and the erasure of their history. If you want a great breakdown of the history of the Native Americans and their tragic history, the YouTube channel Knowing Better has a great in-depth video on the history of Indian removal in the United States and Canada. If you want a real-life story of a post-apocalyptic world, the experiences of the various North American tribes fits the bill. First contact with European conquerors and settlers brought never-before-experienced diseases, wiping out upwards of 90% of the population. In fact, often the first emissaries of Europe weren't even people at all, but the diseases that spread like wildfire through the continents. Early settlers might come upon lands that were perfect for planting and settling, sometimes not realizing that the people that lived there had recently just died off. As time went on, the European settlers might enter into treaties with the Indians, only later to have those treaties broken as it was found that the Indians were just, quite frankly, in the way. They were constantly displaced, moved often by force to less desirable lands. Even when the people like the Cherokee played by the white men's rules, they often lost in court because the laws of the various states were written to specifically exclude Indian participation. Often the white settlers felt justified in what they were doing because the people that they were displacing weren't Christian, and they practiced religions and had other cultural practices that the whites felt offended their God. Native populations were constantly displaced as westward expansion progressed, often violently, almost always accompanied by duplicitous motives. Eventually, the reservation system came to prominence in the late 19th century. There were also programs to take the children of the various tribes and put them into schools that would strip them of their cultural background. There would be prohibitions on practicing their religions and on speaking their languages, and they would often have to cut their hair. There seemed to be a concerted effort to utterly erase the history of these various people. In the face of that tragedy, the various Indian tribes have been trying to rebuild a cultural heritage. But a lot has, of course, already been lost. So how does Mormonism fit into all this? In the early 19th century, Joseph Smith lived on the frontier. He often heard stories of Indians, and he likely saw them as they traded with towns in his area. There was a lot of lore concerning the Indians that permeated the zeitgeist. As settlers moved into former Indian lands, they would come upon the remains of their culture. In Joseph Smith's area, there were great mounds that were left behind. A commonly held belief that permeated American culture at the time was that people with darker skin were inferior to white people, or even that they were cursed by God for some deep sin from the past. And as such, they didn't have the ability to accomplish some of the great feats that the settlers would come upon. Also, there was a strong belief that some of the remnants of the lost tribes of Israel had made their way to the Americas. They were broken into two groups, a righteous, light-skinned group and a wicked, dark-skinned group. And that it was the light-skinned group of people that were responsible for the things that the settlers came upon. But at some point in the past, the dark-skinned group eventually overcame and wiped out the others and became the Indians. Now this sounds a lot like the plot of the Book of Mormon, doesn't it? Now that is of course because this common belief was written into the Book of Mormon. That belief was eventually discarded by society, but persists in the Mormon Church in the form of the Nephites, the white and delightsome people, and the Lamanites, a people cursed with a skin of blackness due to their disobedience. So a racist belief in 19th century America was ultimately canonized into the Book of Mormon, but I will talk more about that in another video. In the Book of Mormon narrative, the Nephites eventually fall away from the teachings of Jesus and are destroyed by the Lamanites. And it was understood for well over 100 years that the Native Americans were in fact the Lamanites, who were descendants of the house of Israel. The first missionaries from the new formed Church of Jesus Christ went to preach to the Lamanite tribes. The introduction of the Book of Mormon used to say that the Native Americans were the principal descendants of the Lamanites. But now it says that they are among the descendants of them. In short, the Book of Mormon tries to rewrite the history of the American Indians. So, how do I come into this? My mask notwithstanding, am a pretty white dude. Now, I don't know if I'm a pretty dude, but I am pretty white. But my family lore has stories of Cherokee descendants. I was told that one of my maternal great-grandmas was full-blood Cherokee. In fact, looking at my grandma, one could easily see many Native American traits, including her skin color. My mom would even tell me that one of our ancestors was a Cherokee princess. Now more on that in a minute. But why would I doubt it? Because of this lore, I became fascinated with Native Americans and their various cultures. I remember learning some of the basics of Cherokee writing system that was developed by Sequoyah. And in the days before Google, I made attempts to track down some of that ancestry. Though, being a kid, I only put in so much effort. But that lore persisted as I grew and I joined the church. As I learned about the people described in the Book of Mormon, I began to think that because I had Indian ancestry, I must be related to the Lamanites, which of course leads to the title of this video. I thought I was a Lamanite. And this was something I was kind of proud of. In high school, several kids from the Duckwater Shoshone Reservation went to my school. But in my researching, I could never find concrete corroborating evidence of my Native ancestry. So I didn't try to insert myself into their group. It just didn't feel like I should. Eventually, in most young Mormons' lives, they get their patriarchal blessing. A patriarchal blessing is considered personal scripture to those that receive it. It's believed that the patriarch tells that person things that God wants them to know specifically. Certain life decisions they should make, certain personality traits that they were blessed with, a heads up on certain challenges that person may have, or even a glimpse of what the person was like before they were born. But most importantly, it lays out a person's lineage in the house of Israel. It will tell you what tribe you come from. It's something that's supposed to make a person feel special and seen by God. And because I believed I was of Lamanite descent, I would come from one of the uncommon tribes of Israel, because of course, Native Americans descended from Hebrews that came to America. I felt that being in one of these less common tribes would make me more special. I know, I had illusions of grandeur. Maybe, I don't know, I still do. To my disappointment, the patriarch told me I was from the tribe that they said that most people were from. I felt dejected. I wasn't special after all. But ultimately, it didn't shake my testimony. I figured that there must be something I just didn't understand. I continued on and eventually made progress on my research into my Cherokee ancestry. The first thing I came upon was that the whole Cherokee princess thing was a myth. I found out that it was a term of endearment that Cherokee men would call their wives. It's not unlike how we might use the term princess as a term of endearment, or sweetheart, or babe, or sugar, or whatever. What are some terms of endearment you use? Some also speculate that it was an attempt to dispel some of the racism regarding interracial marriages. If a white man felt like he married into Indian royalty, it could go a long way into appeasing any racist family members. I learned that a great indicator that a person likely doesn't actually have Indian ancestry is that if they have this story in their family lore. I also learned about the Dawes Act of 1887. Now, the Dawes Act was an attempt for the U.S. federal government to deal with the so-called Indian problem. It essentially codified much of the problems associated with the reservation system that persists even to today. Part of the act allotted land to tribal members. As a result, it created membership rolls. For many tribal affiliations, a person has to establish ancestry to a person on these rolls. As I tried to find that ancestry, I always came up short. But it could just be that my ancestors didn't sign up on the rolls at all. But by that time, I was accepting the fact that I likely didn't have the Native American ancestry that I grew up thinking I did. The final piece of evidence came when I did the 23andMe genetic test. You spit into a tube and send it off, and they will tell you your ancestry all the way back to Africa. Here is my recent ancestry breakdown. You can see that I am mostly British or Irish and French or German. I appear to be precisely 0% Indigenous American, and because of how European I am more Neanderthal than I am Cherokee. I have about 250 genetic variants that can be traced to Neanderthals that bred with modern humans about 40,000 years ago. So, growing up, I thought I was of Cherokee descent, something I was proud of. Then, as I joined the church, I thought I was a Lamanite, again, something I was proud of. Then I realized that there are no such things as Lamanites, and that I have no Indian ancestry, which was, of course, disappointing. I lost something I thought of myself, but it made me reflect on a false history I had been given about myself. I made certain assumptions about who I was based on where I thought I came from. Fortunately, I didn't embarrass myself by insisting on this false history. But because of this false history, I couldn't appreciate where I actually came from. I could have learned stories of my actual ancestry. I could have traced my path down through history eventually to me, the good and the bad. I did eventually learn that some of my relatives essentially lived the narrative of John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath. They were poor farmers from the Great Plains that made their way to California during the Great Depression. As I reflected on that, I tried to put myself into the shoes of a Native American that had been told a false history of their people. I asked myself, what harm could it do? What harm is it if their ancestral language is forgotten? What harm is it when their sacred dances are lost to time? What harm is it having their traditions rooted out? The harm is that they lose a part of who they are. To impose a false narrative is to steal away a person's heritage. Me thinking I was a Lamanite separated me from the real people that contributed to who I am. Telling Native Americans that they are Lamanites puts a bunch of false assumptions about their journey. It steals from them their journey and tells them a false narrative about their spiritual and cultural background. The Book of Mormon perpetuates a long, debunked history about the story of the origin of the Native Americans. Now, apologists will try to spin it in that the Nephites and the Lamanites eventually merged with other groups that were already here, or that we don't know what a Hebrew's DNA looked like around 600 BC. But we do know a lot about what happened in the Americas before Columbus. And though I will shy away from absolutes, I can fairly confidently say that there weren't Christian Jews living in America before Jesus was born. Now, a lot has been taken from Native Americans. The Book of Mormon is just one piece of trying to rewrite their history and redefine them as a people. Telling a false history can make a person ashamed of who they are. The Indian placement program operated by the church until the 1990s took Native American children out of their homes and placed them in LDS homes. It served to ultimately weaken these children's ties to their communities. Because these children were told that they were Lamanites, they were told that they were cursed by God, that if they lived the LDS gospel, that the curse would be lifted and that their skin would be lightened. In 1960, Spencer Kimball of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles claimed that children that participated in the program were becoming physically lighter. He said, "The day of the Lamanites is nigh. The children in the home placement program in Utah are often lighter than their brothers and sisters in the Hogans on the reservation." So what does it do to a person to tell them that they have been cursed by God? That their skin is a mark of God's disapproval because of the disobedience of their ancestors. The Book of Mormon has a lot of problems, but one of the most insidious ones is how it steals the histories of diverse groups of people and heaps on them a false sense of guilt. But what are your thoughts? Were you ever told a false history? Let me know down in the comments. And if you like what I do here, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you again in the next video.